Well, good afternoon, everyone. And if it is not afternoon for you, but another time in the world, then good morning or whatever. We're just going to focus today on the PowerPoint presentation. I won't be jumping in with a particular view of myself. That would be truly awful, I think, given that we're now 5 weeks into our lockdown and I've yet to find anyone that can cut my hair. But let us start. You can, if you want, contact me on my email address I've just shown you, and I will send you a copy of this presentation. You can also send in any questions or comments, and kindly Seb, who will be moderating, will feed these back to me. And if need be, we don't have a chance to answer all of them, which I doubt we will in the kind of hour and a half we've got, then I will have a look at those for the next session. So a bit about me. My name's Derek Smith. So I have worked as a Director of Services. I was the Director of Services for the Royal National Institute of Deaf People. I have been a fundraiser, a management consultant. I was also a Director of Services for a large UK local authority. And whilst my bidding is pretty varied, and it has ranged from everything from working with Jewish Orthodox groups on their special needs to, I think the most interesting one was actually winning a tender to support and raise the morale of troops overseas, which was an interesting contract because we had to work out how to get volunteers onto a ship in a situation where there may be a war, but a situation which actually is not uncommon for some of the organisations we're working with. So let's have a look at the programme we've got. We're going to have a look today particularly at some of these issues in terms of the fundamentals of fundraising. And we're going to look at particularly today what a fundraiser is looking for. And we're going to look at some of the key issues for you. We're going to follow that up in our second session with looking at a marketing approach, which is something you may not have come across before, as I found very few people have actually been trained in the concepts of service marketing. And then we'll have a look at what we know about the funders and what they say is actually important to them. So the things that are going to be in scope in today's session are particularly applications around grants, charitable funders, philanthropists, local, state and national governments, and for those of you that can access it, lottery bodies. We're not going to be covering too much around community fundraising, of course, which is individual donations, corporate relationships, and research bids, particularly, which are more likely to be funded by specialist bodies. And today my aim is to give you an understanding of what makes a good bid. And I'm hoping that you're going to come away with at least one idea that will improve your bids. So we're going to have a look at this issue of what is fundraising. Then we're going to have a short break. We're going to look at some questions, and then we're going to look in more detail at the issue of what's the core construct of a funding bid. As I'm going to look at later, no matter what bid you do, there's a pretty similar core construct that follows in terms of those bids. And we're also going to look at some ideas and thoughts that you can take away when you improve your fundraising afterwards. So let's think about this idea of fundraising overall. So fundraising is really, at its most simple, simply selling a good idea to someone else. But in order to sell something to someone else, you've really got to come up with a compelling argument as to why that person or individual should buy your service or product, but compared with another service or product offered by someone else. And the key issue to think about here is funders are probably looking at more bids in a week than you will probably write in a year. So one thing to be thinking about as you think about this issue of a compelling argument is that often you may be dealing with people that come from a similar background to you and actually may well have a detailed knowledge of the programs you're operating and some of the issues. And you might think, well, why is that? Well, it's pretty simple, really. If you are reading 60, 70 bids in a month, you soon get a pretty good idea about what bids are good and what bids may not be good. So one of the things to be thinking about when you're producing your bid is, how can you prove your bid represents good practice? Because the funders will have often many examples of what good practice is. So think about those issues in terms of what your good practice is. So all bids really start with this idea of identifying the needs first of all. When you've identified the needs, then you've got to be able to convince the funder that you can meet those needs. And so bidding is really in two parts. If you think of it, first of all, you need a product or service. And secondly, you need to sell this product or service. So you've got to get someone to buy it. And someone said to me once, well, actually, as a funder, I get lots and lots of really good and interesting bids. And the truth is, if I had billions of pounds, I would probably fund most of them. But I don't. I only have a limited amount of money, and therefore I'm trying to choose from the ones I've got which one I think is going to do the best job. And what funders tell me is the real weakness is not so much in identifying the need. What separates the good bids from the poorer bids is how you actually deliver the need, and you deliver that need in a way that is going to provide outputs and outcomes. So the funders say, well, actually, I pretty much know there's a need, so you don't need to constantly stress the need. However, if you think you've got an understanding of need that other people don't, then funders are going to be interested in that need. So the other thing to think about is when you're looking at the beginning of any funding application is, yes, I understand the need. I've got a pretty good idea what I need to meet this need, and I think it will produce some great outcomes. But then the issue for the funder is this. If the funder thinks of your bid in this way, it may help you. And that is, the funder is making an investment. They're making an investment in your organization, and they're making an investment in the service. So what they are looking for is, which of the organizations is going to give me the best return for my money? And I think this is one of the things that often is not considered carefully. And often funders will refer to this term, and you may have seen it, as value for money. Now, the issue in terms of value for money is, you might say, well, how can I tell what represents good value for money? The beginning of that is, it's whatever the funder thinks is good value for money. So one way of finding out is asking them. But the other thing is to carefully consider, particularly if you are delivering a service, how effective is your current service? And one way I always suggest organizations look at services is to break down the cost of your service in terms of, what does it cost to deliver 1 hour of the service? Now, I understand for some of you who may be an umbrella organization, that may be a more complex argument. But nonetheless, we can still work out, if we take the total cost and we divide it by what we're doing, whether we're going to provide good value for money. And every organization will have different value for money. So if we think of it, say, in terms of an organization that does training, Well, the first thing that comes to my mind when I look at bids, and I've assessed many bids, so if I look at a bid and I see it's for a training project, one of the first things I'm interested in is how many actual hours of training will you deliver for the budget? So you might have two trainers, they might cost the same amount of money, but sometimes a trainer is only delivering half of their time. And then the question is, well, if another organisation has got a trainer and instead of delivering 50% of their time directly to beneficiaries, they are delivering 75%, then they're likely to provide better value for money. And I've worked with organisations that have been told by their funders, we really like your project, we like your organisation, but we want you to go away and deliver this at a lower unit cost. So you want to be thinking very carefully, what is my unit cost? When the funder looks at my budget and they look at how I've drawn it up, what conclusions will they reach? And some of your funders will be doing that very basic calculation of what is the unit cost of this project. So the partnerships you have, how you've trained your staff, the experience of your staff, whether your staff are full-time, part-time, is all going to be absolutely critical. And so I've looked at bids where people have said, we think it's a brilliant bid. And I said, but the funder may well think it's a bit expensive. So there's one thing that you can do today to help your bids tomorrow. And that is carefully consider, how can I deliver a better value for money? And you can do this in two ways. And the first way is not particularly palatable, I have to say, and that is cut all your costs. Cut the salaries of your staff, reduce the numbers of staff you've got. And it's not a great option because you can only carry on cutting to a degree. However, what you can do is you can use the existing funding you've got and you can make it more effective. An example of that might be, you might choose to get a partner to deliver part of the work because that partner is more experienced, they have lots of additional skills, they might also have lots of funding. And think of it like this, there's nothing wrong with asking a partner, would you be willing to do this for us? Now, if they're being funded to do it, often the answer is yes, why not? So think carefully about, are there other organisations that might do part of the work for you, or you could work in partnership with? So that's only one way you can begin to think. So as I said earlier, you always start with the product, and then in fundraising, we're trying to sell the product. And I can assure you of this, if you have got a brilliant product which represents best practice, meets the needs in a compelling way, you are not going to have to spend as much time and effort as a project which is the opposite. So the worst case is a project which is just, you're asking the funder to do exactly what you did in the previous year. It doesn't appear to be based on current best practice. It's based on what you think is best practice. And the costs look to be high. If that's the case, you will need a world-class fundraiser. So remember, start with the product. So if you have got staff in the field now, you've got staff who are delivering projects, think carefully, how am I going to ensure I get more funding in the future? And when I talk to organisations about how they appraise staff delivering projects, I ask them, well, how would you assess whether it's worked? And their answer is pretty much always the same. Did we deliver the outputs, the outcomes within the budget that the funder asked us for? But I don't think that's enough. Staff involved in any project at the very beginning of the project should be asking themselves and should be assessed on this simple question: what have we done during this year so that this funder is going to fund us again? How have we developed this project, this partnership, so that other funders will fund us? Because you cannot leave the fundraising section to the very end. And often the problem is that people will say to a fundraiser, off you go and raise the funds. Then the fundraiser says, but I'm not sure the project's really developed that much. It's not that innovative. And the problem that often comes is that the project staff, I don't really care. Just go and fundraise for this again. That is a nightmare. And it's also unlikely to be successful. So let's think about some of these essentials of fundraising. So you might think, if we looked at it in 3 parts again, it is pretty simple. You prepare the project, you write the bid, you bask in glory. Great. The one thing I remember heading fundraising teams is that actually you don't remember the successful bids for that long, but you really remember those bids that were unsuccessful for a very long time, and you're trying to work out why. And one of the reasons bids may not be successful is you are likely to get larger bids, larger sums of money, when you have a relationship with the funder. So the statistics, certainly in the UK, are only about 10%, 1 in 10 of bids are successful if you have not got a previous relationship with the funder. So one of the things to be thinking about is it worth putting in a number of smaller bids and work your way up? Have a close look at the funder's website. How many bids are in the larger category? How many are in the smaller? And in some funders, they will say, well, we won't fund projects above this level, or we're unlikely to. And that is often true, but they're more likely to fund an organisation that they've got a relationship with already. So if funding is about a compelling argument, why is it that often we don't actually get our message across? Why are we not making that argument? So if we think about this issue of an argument, then an argument is backed by facts or data in order to make a plausible claim. So if we think about this, and when I look at bids, a lot of what people put in bids are opinions. They may not be based on fact. So you might look at bids and it might say, we have an exceptionally good understanding of the local community in Macedonia. We've been working with them for the last 10 years. And as a result of that, we've been able to meet their needs. Well, actually, that's all an opinion. It's also circular logic. And you see circular logic a lot in bids. And that is based on, because I know this, I will automatically achieve this. Doesn't necessarily follow. So what we need to be able to do is find facts or data to make a plausible claim. Now, sometimes people say to me, well, my project's completely new, but how have I got the facts? How have I got the data? How am I going to make that plausible claim? Well, you can make that claim on the basis of having an argument which to the funder seems that is a rational argument. So you might say, I'm going to working with the homeless people in Calcutta. The main issue that has been presented by local organisations is an increase in young women. The increase in young women seems to be due to a lack of employment opportunities and other factors. On the basis of working with existing women's projects, they say the most likely the most likely way of reducing this is actually working with the families at an early stage in terms of stressing educational opportunities. And then we might say, and the research for this is backed by the University of California. The University of California's field project said women are most likely we can support women in the best way by looking at how we can educate them. And the three ways in which we're likely to ensure families stay together is A, B, and C. As a result of that, our project is going to do this. So you can see what we've slotted in there is a reference to another organisation. And often people think, well, I haven't got the evidence myself. We live in a world with vast amounts of research. You will find research to support your service, your claim, your approach. And that is going to be invaluable in helping you do that. And if we think about this issue in terms of arguments, if we have a good argument, we can substantiate that by evidence. And one thing I would always advise is do your own research for every project. If you're currently working in that area, you should be able to research beneficiaries and partners. And when you do that research, you'll be asking them about the service you're intending to offer. And one of the interesting things I find looking at projects and sometimes evaluating them is that no one's actually asked the beneficiaries, will they turn up? Do they think it's a valuable project? So think carefully about what research will you do? Because the funder expects you to know your beneficiaries. But also, if you're asking them for particular funding, then it's going to want to know what background have you got in terms of carrying out research? Who have you talked to? And one of the issues is that when you're putting together your arguments, you're also putting together an argument as to why the particular way you're going to deal with the problem is the best way. Remember, other people who are bidding may have a completely different view of the best way. And it may be that both you and your competitor organisation have a clear idea and a good argument. But when the funder so funders may often call for bids, and they might say, we particularly want to have bids working with young women, for instance, and we're looking at bids within the education field. So there's going to be lots and lots of different ways you could improve the education of women. And actually, your argument could be as valid as the next, but your argument will need to stand out from those other arguments. So if we take a very simple claim, spending $10,000 a year to employ a teacher 1 day per week in a youth centre will increase young people going into education. Well, actually, it's pretty vague. And actually, it may be a reasonable assumption because it's a teacher. So kind of the kind of statement says it's a teacher. They're in a youth centre. But actually, there's no real linkage in terms of what the teacher's going to do. We're making an assumption that teaching will be good and will help people go into education and training. So if we're going to develop that argument, we're going to have to consider carefully what the curriculum is, which young people are going to go into employment and training. And we're going to need to ensure that that's backed by research and we can have a convincing argument. And one of the questions that was posed before the seminar was, how can I stop or reduce the amount of time I spend on bids? Because aren't many of the questions the same? And the answer is yes. But the thing to remember is those questions are going to be grouped around the project, around the budget, and around the organisation. So one of the things you can think about is preparing a case for support. So a case for support is a document that the whole organisation owns. And what it will do is set out the main basis in terms of your understanding of needs, the programs you're operating. It will include things like how you monitor and evaluate, what the governance structure is, by which I mean how is the project governed and managed from the trustees down to the level of delivery. And one of the things that funders may be interested in is, what are the policies and procedures and systems which underpin your delivery? Because when a funder looks at a project, it doesn't know a lot about it. And what it wants to know is the organisation can be trusted. It has systems and there is evidence. So one of the things you'll want to put in your case for support is evidence from existing funders, evidence from projects that have been funded in the past. And one of the problems with funding is if someone leaves an organisation, often their experience and knowledge of the project goes with them. So make sure you've prepared a case for support. And that case for support is also going to include any academic or other research which supports your organisation's view and understanding. It's also likely, if you do it at an advanced level, to include key messages. So these are the messages which you believe the funder will respond to. These are the issues that are likely to bring a positive response. So for instance, if we look at the current situation around the coronavirus, then it is likely that all projects are going to be asked, if they look at funding now, particularly in countries which are affected by it, about how the project is impacted by the virus and how it's going to respond to that virus. So your case for support needs to be updated. And one of the things you'll be thinking about in terms of messages is, what's the message I want to put to my funder? If you do advanced fundraising, you will be thinking about what the message is going to be, because you should know what is the message you want your funder to understand when they read your bid. And one of the ways you can do this is, when you've written the bid, hand it out to colleagues, friends. If you're, in my case, a rather unfortunate partner who had to look at far too many bids, and trustees, and ask these two questions. When you read that bid, describe the organisation. When you read the bid, describe the service. When you read the bid, describe what you thought would happen as a result. Those are all key messages. And you want to be thinking carefully about the key messages. As we said earlier, you start with the product, but then you have to sell that product to someone who's going to buy it. And in doing so, you'll be wanting to think, what are the key messages that are most likely to lead that person to buy your service? Another issue in terms of arguments is, the best arguments will always educate the funder and add to their understanding. So if a funder reads your bid and they know more about the subject than before, you are more likely to be funded. So that's why we go back to this simple issue about creating a good funding argument. Because when you create this argument, you'll want to draw the funder towards you. And we'll talk a little about how you draw the funder towards you and how you can later, in terms of how you can develop that approach. But the funder expects you to be the expert in the area you work in. And sometimes I read bids and I think, you just have not convinced me you even understand your own beneficiaries' needs, or you understand the needs of the funding, or you know about the program. So I'll give you an example. I worked on a bid and it was to set up children's centres. And the organisation I was working with said, we've had a brilliant idea. We're going to appoint outreach workers. And so my question is, well, why are you going to appoint outreach workers? And they said, well, because they'll outreach to people that don't currently use the service. And so my question was, well, why? Why aren't they using the service? And they said, well, outreach, it's a good idea. And my question was, well, why? I'm not really understanding. And I said to them, did you read the background documents that the funder referred to, and the background documents in relation to the children's centre you're working with? And they said, well, I skimmed it. And I said, well, I looked at them, and what it said was half of all the people in the walking distance of your children's centre that you want to that exists didn't even know a children's centre existed. So maybe you could do something far more basic. Also, why use a worker when surely the key people you want to be working with would be partner organisations? So how will you bring those on board? And then I said, the other thing I realised when I looked through the issue of children's centres in the area you're working with is that the government has just announced additional funding for children's centres. And I said, that's great, we're going to get more funding. And I said, but they've already decided what the funding's for. And they said, have they? I said, yes, it was announced only 3 weeks ago. They said, oh, I've missed that one. And I said, do you know what they're funding? They said, what? Outreach workers. They said, oh. I said, so how do you think they're going to feel when they're already going to give you an outreach worker and you're going to then ask them for another outreach worker? Sometimes, as I said before, people do not convince the funder they are experts in their own area. You have to establish that expertise, and that means doing background reading and research and showing in your bid how that relates to other initiatives. And one of the things that you can improve your bids is by using social authority. Social authority is a relatively simple concept, but what it says is this: if you're applying for funding, often your funders will be using experts. They will use experts for the panels. They will often ask someone about the projects and their views of them. Social authority is about the fact that those people making the decisions on your funding are more likely to accept another person's view, accept the argument, if that person is at the same social level or above. So an example would be, you have referenced your project and it's good, and the expertise and the good practice by a university report, or you have got a quote in there from, let us say, a local social services commissioner or police officer or someone that is working with a refugee community. And they can say, when we've worked with project, we've always been able to achieve the outputs. They've always been successful in meeting the needs. So think about what social authority you can put in your bid. And the key learning here is your bid must demonstrate professional credibility. And That may mean that you will need to use the expertise of your trustees, advisors, or other people. And remember, ideally, the professional credibility should be built into your case for support, because you don't want to be reinventing the wheel every time you write a bid. The same information is likely to be helpful, and also means that your staff and volunteers can add for the case support as they get quotes from other people, from beneficiaries, and they can also build in case studies in that case for support. So when you are developing your argument, use a balanced approach. But what I mean by this is you start in two phases. Phase one is your reasoned argument. And if some of you have been thinking, God, this sounds really dull, what Derek's talking about, reasoned argument, evidence, well, it is a bit dull, but it's only one part of your bid. And people often talk about two dimensions in bids. So one dimension is the reasoned argument, the facts, the figures, the evidence. You can make it more dimensional by creating case studies, by using quotes, by being clear about what you're trying to achieve. And in what you're doing here is you're creating an enticing vision of the benefits that you will deliver. And you can do that from case studies and quotes. So one of the things to remember in terms of the key learning is that funders are not buying the activity. They're not buying simply what you do. All funders buy benefits. So when you're thinking about your project, start with the benefits and work backwards. Think about the benefits the funder might see for the project. And when you are writing, if there are specific projects that the funder has funded, have a look at them. Look at the research they're funding. Don't be afraid to phone up a project. Have a look at the summaries that funders may provide of the work that they've got. Think carefully about what are the sorts of projects they've funded before. But think carefully about what are the benefits they're funding. One of the things that can be difficult is funders buy for their reasons, not yours. And so a lot of time is wasted trying to convince a funder that they should be funding this project anyway. Unlikely to be successful unless you've got a direct relationship with that funder. So, as I've now spoken for nearly 40 minutes, I'm just going to ask if there's any questions. And the only question I've got so far is, will we have access to the presentation? Yes. You can email me on the address I gave before, or we will see if there is a way. Actually, what we'll do is for the next presentation, when we ask for questions, I'll give you we'll provide that presentation so we can send it out then. So I think that's probably the best way forwards. So do we have any other questions? And the answer is it hasn't been recorded to my knowledge, but I will check with the moderator later. We're not going to look at the detail, given Nikki's question, about the application process and how you find it. What I would say is this. It does differ in each country. So for instance, in the UK, there are a couple of services that are at a reasonable fee. And when you subscribe to the services, you're able to then identify what funding you're looking for, and you can then find out what those funders are. So generally, the starting point in terms of what is the system that exists is to find out if there are any umbrella or other organizations. You can, of course, also pay a research organization to do that research for you, but it's not an area that because I'm normally dealing with national funds myself, it's not an area that we're going to cover on this course. So in terms of Caroline's comments, are those guidelines UK specific? Well, guidelines in themselves are likely to relate to the country that you're operating in. So for instance, if you're looking for grant funding, you're going to be relatively limited to a number of well-known grant makers. If, however, you're going to bid for contracts, then you normally will have to have the procedures, policies, and systems that are in place for that particular funder. So, for instance, in the UK, there's a specific department that you would bid for to, and they have a set of rules and regulations and a process that they would expect to be followed. In terms of Rick's question, how important, what guidance do you give about comparing the project you work on with competitors? We're going to cover this in this issue on marketing later, but it is absolutely critical to look and see what your funders are doing. And the reason it's important is when we look at funding and we look at it from a marketing perspective, we can think, well, we can segment, we can separate what the different areas of work are. And we can see what other people are funding. And that will give us an idea of where they are likely to be a major competitor. And the general guidance I always give to people when you're thinking about competitors is try and be an expert in at least one area. If you have the expertise and it's well developed, people are more likely to come to you. So be careful about doing everything possible and not focusing on one area of expertise. And I know it can be difficult, but think of it like this. If you're a manager in a project, your time's going to often be spent supporting different projects. But what's critical is to become an expert in at least one of those areas. So try and focus on the area that you believe makes the most sense for your organization, given your skills and your expertise. And then think about how you might develop in that particular area of work. So it's not an easy one, but what it means is we need to sometimes take a marketing approach in terms of thinking at the current time, what are the areas of work that are most likely to be beneficial in terms of funders? So obviously at the moment, if you're doing a bid, the issue may be about looking at the things such as in terms of coronavirus. And I'm going to cover that in a moment in terms of an example in terms of advice that an organization asked me for. And I can see, as we've all seen, it's actually recorded, which is interesting. And we're not going to talk about fundraising from individuals, which is often called major donor. And the other area of individual funding is really in relation to donations and events and community. That is another quite specialist area. So it's not an area that is my expertise, just as if you're looking at corporate giving, that is also quite different often than grants and contracts. And we're mainly focusing in these sessions around grants, though it may be that we'll look in more detail at the issue of contracts at a later date. Okay, so let's just have a look for a moment then at some of the other issues. But what we're going to do is we're going to take a comfort break. I will then go over one of the examples in terms of the coronavirus issue and an example of an organization. And let's come back. It's 12:02 now, so let's come back actually in 12 minutes time. So in my time, that would be 5 p.m. Okay. Okay, we're going to come back together quite soon. If someone could just drop me a comment just to say you can hear me, that would be great. Thank you, Rick. Okay, well done. And everyone. Well, I'm glad that we're all back in the same room. Um, let's just think about an example then. I said well, I'm looking at an example in terms of some of the issues at the moment and what those might be. Also, I've just sent you a list of some websites. It's actually Grants Online rather than Grant Online. Action Planning have a weekly newsletter which is free and will give you an update on some of the funding. They're not particularly good at overseas funding, but I think if you contact them and said, and you notice that, they might well look at your service. And if you're fortunate enough to get some money for development funding, then I would use an organization like Action Planning or another consultancy, because for a reasonable sum, they will then find out from you which of the organizations across Europe which more are likely to fund you. So that might, generally, most people can't afford it, but if you do get some development funding and you, like for instance, you're bidding for a development officer, always make sure that you put in a budget for doing that research. Okay, so a friend of mine is actually at the moment a chief exec of a food bank. So about 5 weeks ago, she came to me and said to me, I'm really not sure what I should be doing. We've got, our volunteers are all old. They look like they're people that are vulnerable. We are in a situation now where we haven't got enough food, and I'm not sure what we should be doing. My advice to her was stop providing the service at this current time. And she was a bit surprised by that. And I said this, you are going to be swamped with money very, very soon. The funders will take a little while to catch up, but you will be swamped, and you will be swamped with food because there are so many organizations that are going to send you money. So this is your prime opportunity to put in funding bids. And actually, I said, you certainly want to be recruiting new and younger volunteers, but there's an issue here in that this is an opportunity to go to a number of funders who will be offering cash as well as money for food. And the issue for you is, what are you going to do at this time to ensure you get long-term funding? And so we had a bit of discussion about this, and she thought, well, actually, I don't think I can be doing that. We've got so many people at demands at the moment. I can't really give up because, I've only got me and a part-timer doing this. And I spoke to her a couple of weeks ago and I said, what's the situation? And she said, we are turning away food. We have got so much food, we cannot give it away at the moment. We've managed to recruit some volunteers. And the problem we've got now is that we're not social distancing. And then my question was, what's your risk assessment? And she said, we've never done any of this thing before. We've got no risk assessment process in place. So it seemed to me that the issue was very short-term and reactive. I can completely understand that. But one of the things I said to her is, you are going to find lots and lots of people setting up food banks. And they're not going to be organizations like yourself who are part of a recognized national organization. That's going to go on and do it. And they are going to be your competitors. And you are going to be swamped with money in the next few months. But some of those organizations bidding won't have existed before. And what will happen is that the funding will fall off, but the numbers of competitors will grow. And so I understand the issues you've got at the moment, but if you can bring in people to do the day-to-day, even if you can't give out as many food parcels, I'll guarantee this, you will get more funding. And then the issue is, how are you going to use the current situation to be able to survive when the competition's greater? So therefore, how are you going to change what you're doing? And she said, I haven't got time to change what I'm doing. I just need to give out food. I said, well, think carefully about this, because she said, well, we have a system. We only take people through referrals. And I said, well, when I look at the news, I see organisations who are not going through those processes, who are saying, why are we assessing people at all? Why aren't we just getting on and giving out food? And that's what's interesting about that is this whole experience is likely to lead some organisations to new ways of working. And when those organisations are able and the competition becomes greater, some organisations will come out weaker. And that's the real difficulty when you're dealing with a crisis. You can be focusing all of your management resource on the crisis and being reactive. And at the same time, you've got a whole range of new competitors. Because in marketing, we refer to it as segmentation. What segmentation means is people will identify what their market is. So there are organizations at the moment thinking, well, we can do food. And my question to her was, do you think food is just enough? Do you think you might do other things? So for instance, some organizations are saying, well, food isn't enough and we can use food to deal with social isolation. We can bring together people in cooking clubs. We can do other things. And she said, well, I just don't think we have the time to do that. And I said, I understand that. The difficulty is these situations will result in more competitors. And so if you don't respond in your market, you may well find that you will find in the future you'll get less money. It's always a really difficult situation when you have that situation, but some people may come out stronger because of it. And the other thing is they may be able to secure additional funding for their development, their long term, and their core. So think carefully if it ever happens to you, how can I make the most of this situation? So let's think about this issue of why is a funding bid so difficult? Because I think funding bids are amongst the most difficult things that you can write. And there's one really good reason why funding bids are so difficult. And that is very few people have ever been trained in writing skills in relation to a bid. So people may have been on a course which teaches them things about how to research a bid. They might have been looking at things like how you do needs, how you do outputs, and how you do outcomes. But if I asked you as a group, when was the last time you did training around English language and how you can use language to create a compelling argument? I'd be interested. Has anyone been on training in the last 5 years, specifically looking at language and how they can write bids? Anyone been on training? If you are, then drop me a line. No one coming in at the moment. Has anyone been on specific language training since they left school or university in terms of how to write a compelling sentence, for instance? Oh dear, we have the same issue. So it's not surprising, given that it's a difficult communication. And if people have not been trained in the specifics of writing skills, but Sally's a retired English teacher, so thank you for that, Sally. So you have a real advantage. So, and I'm sure Sally would be able to help us. So some of the things which I'm not going to be able to touch on in this course, simple things like using the active tense rather than the passive tense makes your writing more compelling and shorter. So if you are fortunate like Sally, then you have got an advantage in terms of that. But for other people, think carefully about it. And I'll just say one thing to help you. When you are writing, turn on your grammar check, because it will tell you the percentage of sentences in the active and passive tense. And if you look online, examples of switching from the passive tense to the active tense, it's an exercise worth doing. that will help you in your writing skills. And the last thing is to remember that sentences should generally be no more than 15 words. So generally short 15 words with a few longer sentences. And that's because we lose understanding after 15 words. So the shorter the sentence, the better. And similarly, as I'm sure Sally will be able to tell us when she taught her students, when you're preparing an exam, it's a bit like preparing your bid. Students were always taught, write the structure section by section before you write your answer. When you write a bid, write the structure so you know what is going to be in every paragraph before you actually write. So that way you have a clear sequence of paragraphs. And one way of thinking of this, and then make sure that you have clear headings so that the funder knows what that paragraph is about. So one of the problems is we don't have a lot of experience in actually writing, even though we're often writing bids. The other thing is we're trying to work out how on earth the funder is going to respond to our bid. And so one thing that can help you along the way is when you've got a draft bid, give it to a colleague. Ask them, as we said before, what do you think of this bid? What are the things that we could improve? How can I make it more concise? And the other thing is, if the funder doesn't know much about you, try and have as much contact as possible, because then you can establish two-way communication. And I do understand that many funders are not overly interested in having conversations, but there are a number of funders who employ people whose specific job is to talk to organisations. I was doing some research recently and writing for an organisation that deals with carbon capture in the EU. And having found out all the organisations, one of the things that we were doing then was writing emails to key trustees and others that we thought might help. And we looked at all the people we knew who might know funders who could give us an introduction. But try and ensure as much as possible you've thought carefully about what they want, and do phone them up if you can. If you've got a project, you've got an outline, then speak to them about it. And and Sally's comment, would you recommend giving the bid to someone who doesn't know what you do? Absolutely. Absolutely. Because someone who knows nothing about your organisation and the service can answer that question, which is, what does this bid say to me about the organisation? What does this bid say to me about the service? And if the person says to you, look, I've read that and I think it's a bit confusing or it's a bit long-winded, the answer is, what are you talking about, you absolute plonker? Surely you can't read properly. The answer is, okay, I need to rewrite that then. And one of the things I would do, taking Sally's comment, which is really good, find someone who's really, really good at writing concisely. Give them your bid and ask them to make suggestions to reduce the numbers of words by 25%. You'll often find it is possible. So yes, definitely, if you've got someone who can look at it outside the organisation, that will always help. It will give you a different perspective in terms of that. The other thing is get feedback from your existing funders, and we'll talk about that later. Once you do get a bid, get some feedback from them about the bid, its strengths and weaknesses. Because just because you've got the money doesn't mean that there weren't weaknesses that could be addressed. So if we think about this issue in a bid, whose needs have to be met? Well, it may seem a really simple question, But actually, we can think of this in terms of some simple terminology. So customers are anyone that buys from you. Beneficiaries are those that benefit from the funding, and this will include individuals and organizations. And in terms of organizations, the organizations could be quite broad, and stakeholders are anyone or organization that is affected by your funding. So the thing to remember when we're doing bids is the customer is the key person because they are the one that buys for you. And for that reason, we want to think carefully about who should be the beneficiaries. Because if you take many projects, you could choose from a quite extensive range of beneficiaries. And I'll come back to that question, to that issue a bit later. But remember, as far as the funder is concerned, beneficiaries are really important. But it's what the outcomes come from those beneficiaries. And Caroline asks, how much is it common practice to ask for feedback on a bid if not successful? Well, I think it is common, but I still think a lot of people don't do it because they think that the funder won't necessarily want to have the discussion. And some funders will provide feedback and many won't. And you will find that on their forms, it says that we can't provide feedback. And the only time you're likely to get feedback is if you've got a relationship. And I'll give you the reason why. Having been someone in a local authority who was giving out over £15 million a year, when people come to you and they get feedback, one of the problems is they quote all the sections and bits of their bid, which were really, really good, which you actually often ignored, or you didn't take account of. And you might think, and that's why you don't have that discussion. You might think, well, surely you do want to have that discussion. Well, the answer is you don't. And the reason is this. Often bids are written in such a way that you don't pick up the key information and they're not compelling. And so you'll read through a bid and actually you can't remember much about that page, but actually you've got 15 other bids to read. And so you're not going to reread a page. And so often, if a bid is not well written, you simply don't notice things. And I remember the first time someone said to me, would you mind actually going through the bid with me? And I thought later, oh, some really, really good things in that bid. But actually, at the time, I really didn't notice. So when I worked in Lambeth as an assistant director, our guidance was this. We would only overturn any decision if the decision made by the assessor was irrational. And part of the issues is that badly written bids often means you don't take account of them. But the other thing I think is that people often don't get feedback on successful bids. And that is really when you should, because you've got a relationship. And Rick's got a question in terms of comments about differences and advantages of public versus private funding. Well, it depends what you mean by public. One of the issues I think in terms of public funding is that contracts require you to meet specific requirements, though they can be long-term, whereupon grants tend to be one-off and are based on the organisation. A lot of private funding will not have those terms and conditions attached to it because it's likely to be a grant. The exception is large corporate partnership programs where you're likely to need a number of staff. These are the ones which are the kind of £500,000-600,000 a year. So in a way, grant funding applications, if you've got your case for support and you've got your project, you can be putting in the same application to most of the philanthropy funding or to a corporate funder, because often they are not asking for a specific alignment with that organisation. But there's no hard and fast rule. And the general rule with private funding is it's always best to put it in through a contact with someone who works in the organisation. But let us move on. So think of this then, the customer, it's an exchange process. So we need to be thinking constantly about what they want. And the reason for that is it's not what you can give them that counts, but what they want and why they want it. So this goes back to this issue we said before. You can have a great, compelling argument and a great product and organisation, but if you haven't thought about why the funder would want to fund you at this time, you may find that that bid actually is not likely to be successful, because the customer buys for their reasons, not your reason. And that's why we've constantly got this issue of writing bids is one-sided, but we're trying to second guess what that funder is going to want, what those issues are, what their support's going to be based on. So think carefully about who the beneficiaries are. So if we look at this statement, the beneficiaries for our children's breakfast project will be local children. It's a pretty broad concept, isn't it? And as from the funder's perspective, and certainly my perspective as an assessor, I constantly see bids where the beneficiary category, if you like, is extremely broad. Local people, specific refugees. Remember, one of the issues in terms of grant funding is that the funder sees this as an investment. They also see you as the gatekeeper for the project. And one of the most difficult things that charities have to do when they consider funding is working out who they will not be supporting on a project as much as who they will be supporting. And staff on the ground do not want to be saying no to individuals who may be needy. But the funder wants to know that your funding is reaching those that have the greatest need. So it's expecting you to carefully consider who the beneficiary should be. And a project which is not clear about its beneficiaries often means it hasn't thought carefully about who has the greatest needs. So think carefully about these benefits and outcomes, and think about who the beneficiary should be. And it may be in a project the beneficiaries will change over time because the needs change over time. So let's do a resume of some of the issues, given that my voice looks like it's going to go soon. So the funder expects your bid to be underpinned by good practice and applying local knowledge. So educate them, convince them you're an expert, explain the how, why, where, when, and who in your bid. And one of the ways of thinking is think, why should you give me your money at this time, rather than why I want your money. Think about developing a storyboard, and you can go to the big lottery for additional guidance on this. And the lottery is quite useful in terms of what they think the approach should be in looking at a bid. First of all, they say, think about what the problem is. Secondly, what causes the problem? What evidence relates to that? And then identify the need. So a lot of people will start with and say this is the need. But if we've got a problem, then we want to know why it's a problem and what's caused the problem before we even look at what the needs might be that the project is going to meet. An example of a project that I was working on, and when I looked at the project, it was about reducing mortality rates in a particular area. And so the funder was offering quite a reasonable amount of money. And they were concerned that death rates from alcohol and drug use have increased substantially. And so the project, when I looked at it, when I discussed the storyboard with them, remember, always think about the project, throw ideas up in the air before you come down and actually write what you're going to do. And their view was, actually, we think that the major issues in the area are drug deaths and those issues related to that. And I said, okay, let's look at it. So do your research. As I said before, all good bids will have some original research. Look at the funders' research, official research, and statistics. So when we looked at this problem, without coming to any, the things we threw up in the air as we started to develop our case for support were drugs and alcohol were cheaper than ever before. The suicide rates of young men were high. People are unhealthier than ever before. Obesity in the area was 30%. And in relation to the terms of one of the health commissioners, diabetes is out of control. And the other comment was, gang conflict is killing young people. So you see, we've got a pretty varied range of issues, and we may, in our project, focus on them all. But what we want to do is just look at those to see where the focus was, because the funder said there was an increase in deaths. And we wanted to work out what was causing the increase, not what was the main underlying reason for the deaths. And what we found was this: when we looked at the numbers of deaths, the mortality rate, and the mortality segments that were increasing dramatically, it was in two areas. Death rates for young men from heart attacks due to steroids, as most were unaware of the risk. And so this was all available, but it just needed looking at. And the second thing we found in terms of the increase was the over 55s. One part of the city that the project was in was extremely affluent. And what we found was, in that affluent area, there was a very high death rate due to alcohol-related deaths. And when we looked at the data and we talked to organisations locally, the feedback they got was it was people who retired early, who were relatively wealthy. Many single men, in fact, were part of the group. And actually, they were literally drinking themselves to death and drinking every single day. And one of the issues that came up was they weren't aware that actually they were, in effect, drinking a number of units, which actually was far worse than if you just binge drink. And so we decided, in fact, in this project, as part of that, give you an example of the issue in terms of the death amongst young men, we looked at it, talked to gyms, talked to young people, talked to community workers, and we decided on a pair education program in gyms. And one of the things we found out was that trainers, the personal trainers, were selling steroids to young men as a way, and what they were doing was, if you paid for your trainer, you got access to steroids. If you didn't pay for a trainer, you didn't access steroids. So effectively, they'd created a market. And what we were able to do then was to develop an information campaign in the gyms and also engage directly with the owners and the managers of the gym, who I'm not sure whether they were or were not aware of the link between the trainers, but they were able to take all their trainers aside and to discuss the issues. And the feedback I got later was there was a dramatic decline after the campaign. So the key learning here is your bid must demonstrate that it's an effective investment for the funder. The funder is confident that what you are going to do is going to deliver the outcomes for the project. So if we talk about the core construct of a bid, we've started off with the big lottery guidance. We've started with the problem, we've got to the needs. Now we've got the needs, we can start to break down and understand those needs And because we understand the needs, we will design the delivery model to reflect those needs. And then logically, we will link that to the outputs with the things we're going to do, which in this case would be the information campaign, the talking to the gym owners about the steroids, and providing social media and other activities to those young people. And the outcome we're expecting is, one, young people are more aware of the risk of steroids, and two, a decline in the death rate from steroids. So I said before, start with outcomes. So if we think about that, you should always know the outcomes you're intending. So the outcomes are the broad aims from the program. And you can measure those through specific objectives. So always start in your project with what's the needs, what's the model of delivery, what are the outputs, the measurables, and what are the outcomes I'm going to try and achieve. One of the questions we got before the session was, why do I have to have all this innovation all the time? And the definition I use is, innovation is the application of new ideas. So when we think about this, the reason the funder expects innovation, it's asking you to apply new ideas, but those ideas do not have to be your ideas. And often they are not. They will be ideas from another project or from other research. And it demonstrates that you have best practice. So what we're going to do now is, I'll just take that. Oops. Just going to see if we've got any final questions or comments in terms of that before we look at the next step. So Sully's question is about difficulty getting data from our beneficiary cohort, homeless pregnant women, those with new babies. What's the best evidence we can use? But you're right, Sally, in your comments, use your own data, stuff about effective homelessness, but also use research data. Now, the research data might be from the UK. It might also be from other countries. So a lot of the time when I'm looking at bids, what I'm doing is I'm creating a coherent argument because I'm using data from other projects. So the other data says, this is what we know about homeless pregnant women. These are the things that impact them the most. And secondly, what I'm looking for is not just the numbers or quantitative data. What I want to know is what evidence do we have about what has worked, and what evidence do we have about what other projects have achieved outcomes with new babies. So I find that often a simple Google search will bring up some really interesting projects. And I'll give you an example. I worked on a large bid, the first ever bid in a city for palliative care, which some of you may know is when you're dealing with those people who are dying. And one of the questions I asked them was, when I looked at the bid, it said, I'm still not clear how you really identify people who are dying. And they said, neither are we. And I said, but if we look at the program, it says anyone that has less than a year to live, it should enter the palliative care pathway. And then it's 6 months, and then 1 month, different things happen. And I said, and when we look at the research and the data, it says the majority of people who access the pathway have cancer. And that's because there's lots of cancer services. So the question we then had was, well, how are we going to bring in other people who don't have cancer? And we used some research from Ontario. And what they'd done was they'd worked with GPs, and GPs don't really think carefully about whether someone should enter a pathway. They've got 5 to 10 minutes with someone. And what they did in Ontario was develop a really simple form, which only took 30, 40 seconds. And at the end of the form, it gave them an indication of whether the person should enter the palliative care pathway. So it's interesting because it was both a prompt, but also based on previous research, but also it was something that a GP could have. But more importantly, it told the funder we were going to identify new beneficiaries that could benefit from the program. And this was one of a number of things that we were going to do in order to ensure that those beneficiaries were reached. Okay, so Rick's comment is around the issue of sports activities and refugees in Greece. There are a few activities around the world focusing on sports with refugees to improve mental and physical health. How can we collect data? Well, my suggestion on that was if we look at this issue of mental health, we would be able to focus research which says what are the benefits of sport and what sorts of sports are most likely to provide a benefit. So if we're thinking about the issues of sport, and I've looked at this in terms of these sorts of issues in a number of projects, it's likely that sports which involve teams are more likely to be more effective than sports that don't. And I think we could probably look at things as to whether, for instance, having teams of people that regularly compete with each other, who runs the sports, how we enable people to take control. And what we do know about activities is that when people see something that helps themselves, it's more likely to be beneficial than doing something for people. The other research we would know is that men are far more likely to see sport and physical activity as something as beneficial and not related to mental health or physical health at all. And that research, for instance, comes from the work that organizations have done around things like gardening and about how men who see physical activity as relevant. So I would kind of broaden. Sports is important, and you're obviously looking at sports. I mean, you might want to broaden it, Rick, to the issue of activity generally. And what are those activities that are likely to provide? Because I'm not sure, because if we think about this issue of physical activity, are we looking at the core of what we do as physical activity or as sport? And I remember speaking to one organisation, we were looking at this issue, and we said, what's the most cost-effective way of enabling people to improve their activity and their mental health? And we went through loads and loads of things. And actually, I said to them later, the answer is buy them a dog. So an interesting one. So I would have a look in more detail at what we mean by physical activity, how people can have control, and what research do we have in relation to the particular situation that people have. And there's quite a lot of research around things like how football and people competing might work. Have we got any other questions? Okay, so what I'm just going to do now is give you some next steps and thinking about these issues. Just a resume of some of the things that you might do. So think carefully about your current services. So for instance, the issue with Rick, when we talk about sports activities, are we talking about physical activity? How can we link the two? How can we gather the evidence of the sports activities we have got? Do we know what's worked in one country? Can we therefore presume it will work? And then the thing we would need to think of is, why did it work? And I think that's the most important part of the equation. Why did it work? Think carefully about, is there an area of work that you do where you could be the expert? So for instance, could we be the expert in cricket? Will there be certain organisations that will fund cricket? Or would we be experts in how to involve people with disabilities? in sport, and what would those physical activities be that involved people who had, for instance, who might have severe disabilities due to injury. Engage with the funders, check what they already fund. Think carefully in terms of your current service. Can it be more cost effective? And are all the costs in your bid relevant? The other thing is update your website. Funders will look at your website. Is there a section on your website that relates to current or previous funded projects? If there isn't, think about putting one in. Add in comments, positive comments from funders. Even if the project ended 1-2 years ago, put a summary of the project up and who funded it. Because the funder wants to know, have other people funded you? What did they say about it? What did it achieve? You may not need more than 3 or 4 paragraphs, but nonetheless, it gives the funder a track record. And one of the things a funder wants to buy is your track record. So make sure you've got something on your track record in terms of your website. And lastly, think about developing a case for support for your project or organization, and test it out on other people. See if they think that is the case. And think about the common questions you're asked and bullet point the things that you think would make a compelling argument. Okay, and that finishes our session for today. We will be back in touch regarding the next session, which I think was actually scheduled relatively soon. So I'm not sure I'm going to make that, given the issues we've got in terms of, given I think it was the Friday. So I'll come back having talked to Seb in terms of the time to do that, because it took us quite some time, unfortunately, to set up the webinar. That was our first time, and that has robbed me of a significant amount of time. But nonetheless, we will come back to you with some thoughts about the next session and about any questions you've got. And in the last session in this program, we're going to be looking at information on what the funders say. And so we'll be asking you if you are willing, and I understand if people are not, but willing to share the feedback, negative and positive, that people have. The other thing I'm going to suggest, and I don't know, and I'll talk to Seb about this, is if it's possible for us to pull together a list of people who've participated over the 3 sessions. And my advice is this: find a partner person in another organization that deals with funding, who's not in the same field as you, who can partner up with you. So when you've written a bid, you can say to them, look, what do you think about this bid? Do you think I've got it right? You know, you've done the same training. Do you think my messages are right? Was it a compelling argument? So think about buddying up with someone that's going to help you. And I can assure you of this, that is going to really, really help you in the future, because it's a sad and lonely life sometimes being a fundraiser. So find yourself a buddy. Thank you very much.